One evening, Thomas invited a friend over for dinner, someone Rachel hadn't met before. "James is in town for a conference," Thomas said. "You'll love him. He's a good guy." Rachel wasn't prepared for how much she would like him. As the night wore on, Rachel found herself laughing more than she had in a long time. Thomas noticed too. He caught her eye once or twice across the table, but she simply shrugged it off, chalking it up to the excitement of meeting someone new. "Rachel, you okay?" James asked, his voice low, pulling her out of her thoughts. She blinked, realizing she had been staring at him a little too long. "Oh, sorry, just lost in thought," she replied, a small laugh escaping her lips. James smiled back, his gaze lingering just a second too long. Later that night, as Thomas and James were discussing work over drinks, Rachel found herself slipping away to the kitchen. She needed a moment. Why was she feeling this way? Why did her heart race a little faster when James was near? She shook her head, telling herself it was just the novelty of meeting someone new. But the next few weeks proved her wrong. James began showing up more frequently at their home. Business meetings, social events, casual dinners. Each time, Rachel found herself drawn to him more. The chemistry between them was undeniable, even if Rachel didn't want to admit it. One evening, as they stood alone in the kitchen, James reached over to hand her a glass of wine. Their fingers brushed, and Rachel felt a spark that made her breath catch. James said, his voice quiet, yet heavy with meaning. "There's something between us, isn't there?" Rachel froze. Her heart thudded against her chest. She didn't know how to respond, but the truth was already sinking in. She was in uncharted territory. Rachel's mind raced as she stood there, her hand still hovering over the glass James had offered. His words lingered in the air like an unspoken promise. There was a tension between them now, something that wasn't there before, and it made her heart beat faster. James took a step closer, his presence almost overwhelming. He repeated, his voice softer this time, but still full of that same intensity. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in around them. But when she looked at him, really looked at him, she couldn't deny the pull. She had been craving something more, something exciting. And James was everything Thomas wasn't. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them. James' smile was slow, but it wasn't playful. It was serious, almost like he knew exactly what was going through her mind. "I'm saying, you don't have to pretend," his eyes never leaving hers. "We both know there's something here. And we both know it's not just going to go away." Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine. She had been living in the safety of her marriage for so long. Now, with just a few words, her entire world felt as though it was unraveling. She wanted to step back, to tell him this was wrong, but there was a part of her that couldn't stop herself from leaning forward, from wanting more. "I don't know," her voice shaking. "This is complicated. You're Thomas's friend." James stepped even closer, their faces inches apart now. "I know. But that doesn't change how I feel." "It doesn't change how you feel." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She was caught between the loyalty she had for her husband and the undeniable attraction she felt for James. She wanted to pull away, to shut this down, but part of her was already giving in. James placed a hand gently on her arm, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her body. I'm not going to force you into anything, Rachel. But I can't pretend this isn't happening. You deserve more than this. But right now, in this moment, she didn't know what to do. She could feel her resolve slipping, piece by piece. And then, as if the universe was giving her a sign, the sound of Thomas's voice echoed from the living room, calling her name. Rachel? You all right in there? Rachel stepped back, almost stumbling, and shook her head as if to clear the fog that had settled there. She quickly composed herself, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. I'm fine, just grabbing another drink, she called out, her voice steady, though her heart was still pounding. But as she turned to face James once more, she knew one thing for certain: nothing would be the same after tonight. But as the evening wore on, the tension between her and James only grew stronger. Every glance they exchanged felt loaded, and every word that passed between them felt like a small crack in the dam that was holding back the inevitable. Thomas was in the living room, needing a moment to breathe, to gather her thoughts. But every time she did, she'd find James waiting for her, as if he knew exactly when she needed him. Rachel stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air. The night was cool, the stars twinkling above. As she leaned against the railing, trying to clear her mind, James appeared beside her, his presence familiar and comforting yet utterly dangerous. You're running away from something, his breath warm against her ear. Rachel didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the city below. I'm not running away, she replied, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. I'm just trying to think. She could feel the heat radiating off him, and it made her pulse quicken. Is it about Thomas, or is it about us? Rachel turned to face him then, her breath catching as their eyes locked. I don't know what to feel anymore, Rachel confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I love Thomas, but there's something about you. I can't explain it. It's like you're everything I've been missing. James reached out, gently cupping her chin, tilting her face up so she had no choice but to look at him. You don't have to explain anything. You don't have to fight it, Rachel. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers just barely, a tease, a promise. It was enough to ignite the fire within her, enough to make her heart race. She could feel the tension building to a breaking point, her body yearning for something she hadn't allowed herself to desire. The sound of the door opening interrupted the moment. Rachel? Everything okay? Thomas's voice rang out, cutting through the charged silence like a knife. Rachel stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly composed herself, trying to hide the chaos she was feeling. Yeah, everything's fine, she said, forcing a smile. Just getting some air. As Thomas walked toward her, oblivious to the near explosion of emotions that had just occurred, Rachel felt a sense of dread settle in her stomach. The days after that night were a blur for Rachel. She tried to pretend it hadn't happened, that it was just a fleeting moment of weakness. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. James had become more than just a temptation. One afternoon, Rachel found herself in the kitchen preparing dinner, her movements mechanical, almost robotic. Thomas was in the living room, watching TV, lost in his world. For a moment, Rachel felt like she was living two lives, one with Thomas, the life she had built, and one with James. As she chopped vegetables, she felt a presence behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. James's voice came softly, like a whisper in the air. But I needed to see you. Rachel paused, her knife suspended in midair. The air seemed to thicken around them, and her heart raced. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to steady herself. "James, this isn't right." "You don't have to say it," he replied, stepping closer, his voice warm, almost pleading. "I know. But that doesn't change what we feel, does it?" Rachel turned to face him, her heart in her throat. "No, not," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "But I'm married. I have a family. I can't just throw that all away." James reached out, gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "I'm not asking you to throw anything away, I'm asking you to choose what makes you happy. And right now, it's not Thomas, is it?" Rachel closed her eyes, torn between guilt and desire. The words hung in the air like a weight, suffocating her. "I don't know what makes me happy anymore." "You don't have to decide now," James said softly, his voice a promise. "But know that I'm here. I'll always be here." Before Rachel could respond, they were interrupted again, this time by the sound of Thomas's voice calling from the living room. "Rachel? You okay, in there?" Rachel quickly stepped away from James, her heart pounding in her chest. She forced herself to compose her thoughts, to mask the turmoil inside. "Yeah, everything's fine," her voice shaky but controlled. James didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment, his eyes locked on hers, full of understanding. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The next morning, Rachel found herself standing at the kitchen window, staring out into the backyard. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the garden. "Rachel?" She snapped out of her thoughts to see Thomas standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay? You've been awfully quiet this morning." "I'm fine," Rachel said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She turned back to the window, trying to shake off the weight of the moment. "Just thinking." Thomas didn't look convinced, but he let it go. "I was going to grab some coffee. Want me to make you a cup?" Rachel nodded absently. "Sure." As he disappeared into the kitchen, Rachel's phone buzzed on the counter. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the name on the screen. James. Her finger hovered over the screen for a long moment. She could ignore it, pretend nothing had happened, but she knew she wouldn't be able to forget. She read the message instead. "I can't stop thinking about you, Rachel. We need to talk again. Meet me tonight?" Rachel stared at the screen, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to reply, wanted to say yes, but she knew the consequences. What if this wasn't just a fling? What if James was the one who could make her feel alive again in a way Thomas no longer could? "I'm meeting someone tonight," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Thomas appeared again, holding a cup of coffee in his hand. "Who?" he asked, noticing her distracted gaze. Rachel quickly put her phone down and grabbed the coffee from his hand, forcing herself to smile. "Just a friend. Nothing important." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. James wasn't just a friend. He was everything she was afraid of, everything she wanted but couldn't have. As the evening drew closer, the tension inside her grew unbearable. She had made no decision, but deep down, she knew she was going to meet James. She had already chosen. The phone buzzed again. Rachel's heart raced. There was no turning back now. She wasn't sure what would happen next. Rachel stood in front of the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been more conflicted in her life. The doorbell rang, and her pulse quickened. She swallowed hard, taking one last look in the mirror before walking toward the door. There, standing on the other side, was James. He smiled, and for a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice filled with a mix of longing and expectation. She hesitated. She had promised herself she would think this through, that she wouldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. But as James stepped closer, the pull was undeniable. Her breath hitched, and for the first time in months, she felt alive. She opened the door wider. "I'm glad you came," James whispered, his lips brushing against her ear as he stepped inside. The minutes stretched into hours, the time slipping away as their feelings for each other took over. The world outside didn't exist. There was only them. But even as the intensity of their connection grew, a voice in the back of Rachel's mind whispered warnings, about Thomas, about her children, about the family she had almost forgotten she was risking. At the end of the night, as the last traces of their shared moment faded, Rachel stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. James was gone, his presence lingering in the room like a storm that had passed but left chaos in its wake.